What's going on, guys? Zers here. A subscriber of mine asked me to do a video on how to think critically, which I think is a very interesting video topic. So I was like, okay, I can do that. So, thinking critically. I'm going to do this. The interesting thing about thinking critically is, I don't know, I think I'm a really special person. The reason why I say that is because when I was in school, I went through this special program called early college, or most people would call it dual enrollment. So basically what happened was I went to high school for 2 years, went through this accelerated learning program, and then after that I went to a community college or a state college that was about a mile away from my school in order to get my AA degree really fast. It was dual enrollment. And I was one out of 27 or 28 kids who actually successfully completed that program, which kind of makes me feel good about myself, makes me feel a little special. However, I say all that because a very interesting thing about the whole idea of critical thinking was the fact that it was one of the most important lessons I learned in school. And it's kind of sad to see that a lot of other people aren't taught that whole critical thinking thing. So, when it comes to critical thinking, one person's name comes to mind more than any other teacher I've ever had. And his name is Reginald Binyard, or Mr. Binyard. Or I called him Binyard because forget all that Mr. stuff, right? So, Mr. Binyard taught our class how to think critically. And today, I'm going to give that knowledge back to some other people since a subscriber asked me to make a video on the topic. Alright, so, thinking critically. Interesting. Before we really get into thinking critically, let's have ourselves a criteria. What does it mean to even think critically? The definition of critical thinking, according to Google, is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. So, with the criteria out the way, when it comes to critical thinking, there's two very important things that we have to discuss before we enact the actual labor of critical thinking. And that is the two terms known as objective thinking and subjective thinking, which are two very important things. So, objective thinking or objective reasoning is looking at the object of something or looking at what something is independent of your emotional feelings. So you look at something objectively, you look at what it is, the facts of what it is, the results, the action, the cause, whatever it is, you look at it independent of how you feel about it. Okay, so objectively speaking, this is a pick or a comb. Its objective is to straighten out my hair and to get out all the naps. That's objectively, that's just what it is, independent of how I may feel about it. Subjective thinking is how you feel about this subject matter of what it is. It is your emotional thought and your emotional pattern and how you feel about any given topic. So my subjective thinking of this thing is, I don't really like the color of it too much because red's my favorite color and I like a more darker neutral blue. But I mean, seafoam blue, it's alright. That's subjective thinking. So objective thinking, what it is. Subjective thinking, how you feel about it. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people don't really look at things objectively nowadays. They look at things subjectively. And the first step when you really want to critically think about something is objectively thinking about what it is. What are we talking about? What's going on here? What's happening? Because I love making videos about slut shaming so much because it's such a hilarious topic to me and it's ridiculously stupid as well, I'm going to use slut shaming to go through a critical analysis of it all. Okay? So objectively speaking, what is a slut? A promiscuous woman. Point of fact, that's just what it is. First step of critical thinking is evaluating what it is. What are we talking about? We're talking about sluts. Now, subjectively, we're thinking, how do I feel about sluts? Well, personally, they're alright people in terms of whatever they can do. I mean, independent of their slutty actions, they can be great people or they can be terrible people. However they are is kind of independent of their slutty actions. So, how I feel about them depends on how the person treats me. But, I mean, them being a slut is objective fact. Either they are promiscuous or they're not. Which shows, again, subjective and objective things are two separate things. How you feel, what it is. Right? So when you think critically, you have to always, the first step when it really comes to thinking critically is stopping and taking a step back. The reason why is because too many people, critical thinking is a skill, and it's a skill that has to be taught to you, and you have to practice and you have to learn. So the first step is you have to stop and take a step back and get out of your feelings. Because usually whenever you hear something, your emotional feelings, it's triggered. You always have like a knee-jerk reaction to it. So the first step in thinking critically is to avoid that knee-jerk reaction, not let your feelings get hurt, and take a step back. Right? You gotta stop and analyze it. And that's really hard. That's probably maybe one of the hardest parts when it comes to thinking critically, is the fact that you have to stop and get out of your emotional feelings and actually sit down and say, what are we talking about here? Now, it turns out a lot of feminists and social justice warriors, forget that, a lot of people in general just can't do that. Again, it's a skill, and you have to practice and you have to learn. If you ever catch yourself getting angry at something, stop, right? And ask, why am I angry? And then, the second part of critical thinking is you have to ask yourself questions, and then you have to answer those questions, okay? So, one of the most important things is, you have to stop and ask yourself, well, why do I feel the way I feel? Now, this is on the subjective level of thinking. Why do I feel so angry? And you have to answer that question. Well, I feel angry because, well, X, Y, and Z. Well, why does this bother me? And you have to stop, and you have to think, and you have to answer the question. Now, this delves into the topic of self-reflection, which is an entire topic unto itself. Now, the absolute backbone of critical thinking is asking questions. Now, the interesting thing about asking questions, especially asking people who lack the ability to critically think, is that they get upset when you ask them questions that they don't have an answer to. And the reason why is because it causes a bit of cognitive dissonance in their brain, and they don't like the way it feels, and so they just automatically react negatively to it, instead of stopping and really putting distress on their brain to think. Because in all actuality, thinking can sometimes be pretty hard. And again, that's why it's a skill, and it's something that you're going to have to practice and train on doing. It's actually sitting there and thinking, because again, the act of thinking it's not really easy for everyone to do. Not saying everybody is stupid, it's just that due to the way that a lot of us have been raised in our society these days, everything's been very instant, especially with cell phones and text messages and the internet. A lot of people don't have the patience to sit and really focus on something and really think about it. Not saying everyone has ADHD, it's just, a lot of people just are moving way too fast and they need to. So, again, when it comes to critical thinking, you have to be patient, and you actually have to put the stress on your brain to think and answer questions that you may not want to answer sometimes. And that's where, personal strength comes in when it comes to critical thinking. Now, another interesting thing about critical thinking is the main idea, right? Now, again, this is something that you have to train your brain to do. And this is something that I spent my entire time in high school and middle school and elementary school learning, and that is figuring out the main idea and what details are important, what details are not important. This is why whenever I watch or do video responses, there are certain parts that I can edit out that won't change anything that's happening because they're just not important. So, main idea is what exactly is the main purpose, or what is the overall theme or the overall point or the overall argument that someone is trying to make. What's the main idea? And then after you figure out the main idea, what are the supporting ideas that add to this person's argument or that add to this person's point? Right? Now you have to identify this, especially when you're doing video responses, because it's what's going to guide what you're going to say and what you're arguing against. It's going to be able to decide what's important, what's not important, what's to keep out. So this is actually just can be summed up as in you have to pay attention to detail, and you have to listen to what people are saying. That's right. When you critically think, you have to listen to what the other person is saying. Too many times in our society, people just wait for their turn to talk. You can't do that when you want to critically think. You have to evaluate each sentence and each word the person is saying and say, is this useful or not? What's the main idea? I don't know. If you read an article about making chicken sandwiches, the main idea is how to make chicken sandwiches. Sorry, this first thing came to mind. The main idea is how to make chicken sandwiches. So every sentence that has anything to do with, that talks about, it talks about the author's children is not really all that important. Well, my children really love it when I make chicken sandwiches. Well, that's interesting, I guess, but the main idea is how to make chicken sandwiches. So when it says, get 2 slices of bread and put mayonnaise on both sides, that's a supporting idea to the overall theme of how to make chicken sandwiches. If the author then comes and says, my son really likes it when I only put mayonnaise on 1 slice, that's not really important. To you, the main idea is how to make it. And even with that last sentence, it's still not that, it's not all that important, but it is not as important as the actual directions of making the chicken sandwich. I know, I use chicken sandwiches, one funny thing, right? For a really good example of critical thinking, there are lots of YouTube videos that I've done where I had to stop and really evaluate what someone says. It happens a lot when I do video responses to Lacey Green, where I have to stop and think and evaluate what's the main idea, what is she talking about, what's going on. In fact, I do that so much that half the time I don't even realize that I'm doing it. So at this point, it's almost second nature, this whole idea of critical thinking. And that's the point. So when it comes to critical thinking, you have to do it a lot, you know. So I guess to sum up, the basis of critical thinking to get you started, because again, it's a skill and you're going to have to practice this. First thing, recognize objective thinking and subjective thinking. Recognize whether or not you're feeling a certain way or whether you're actually talking about what the thing is unto itself, what the object is, or what the main goal or the objective is. So you're going to have to recognize that you're trying to figure this out. And once you figure out what something is objectively, then you can start thinking about how you may feel about it. Because how you may feel about it can become a bias. You want to make sure you check your bias out of the door when you're trying to evaluate an idea, because the way you feel can sometimes hinder you or block the way you might, or block a conclusion that might be reasonable, but because it makes you feel a certain way, you're like, forget it. So remember, you think subjectively after you evaluate something objectively. So understand those two ideas, objective, subjective. After that, you gotta ask yourself some questions. What are we talking about? What's good and what's bad? Why are we talking about this? Ask yourself questions to figure out the idea a lot better. The third step, figure out the main idea and the supporting details. What's the main purpose of whatever the person is saying? What are the supporting details? What's not important? What is important? What should I highlight? What should I not highlight? And these, again, are very important things that are going to help you think about what's the main idea, what's the objective, what are we talking about, what are the pros, what are the cons. The backbone of thinking critically is asking yourself questions and then answering those questions. It is also listening to what people have to say, or reading and paying attention to what someone has wrote, and evaluating what's important and what's not important based on the main idea. So hopefully this is giving you guys some kind of foundation to get you started on critical thinking. It's a very interesting topic. It's a really funny topic. I find it both sad and refreshing. That I find it sad that we have to teach people how to think critically, because that should just be a skill that you learn in school. But I find it refreshing that someone actually wants to know the basis of thinking critically. So hopefully you guys gotten something out of today's video. And if you did, man, go ahead and click that like button. Go ahead and click that subscribe button. Comment in the comments below. And as always, have a great day. I'll see you cool cats soon. Adios.